Hello and welcome back to Perspectives, bringing you our daily dose of news and views we hope are relevant to you. In today's show, Sikh organisations get the opportunity to air their issues at the United Nations. We have reaction to the appointment of Harmeet Dhillon as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the US. And talking of human rights, India is at it again as they send in the state jackboot to yet again stamp down on another human rights organisation in the country that dared criticise Modi's regime. And following our theme of corruption, we take a deeper look at how Modi's regime and its unavoidable taint of corruption it just can't shake off is actually holding the nation's prosperity and growth back. Well, joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and my apologies to the viewers for missing the last episode, but I am back and we are here to bring you a great show today. Make sure you leave your comments and let us know what you think.
Indeed, and James and I together will be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And as usual, we'll be taking a look at lots of your great comments, which have been filling up below our videos. So thank you as always for those. Right, James, let's get things going. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
Well, of course, we know that the Modi government is always defending the BJP and his own comments and their own human rights abuses when it comes to the Sikh community. And here the police are now going after other groups who are calling out different crimes and different human rights abuses there in India. And I thought that this, although it is more of a Muslim crackdown when it comes to this group, it really shows that the Sikhs are not alone, and it really emphasizes the credibility of the declaration of human rights abuses by the Sikh community by seeing that it's happening to all of these other minority groups as well. This is something that we've known for quite some time and that we report on, but it gives that credibility in the international community for those who don't follow the India politics and human rights abuses as closely as we do. So this story here that I'm going to reference in today's episode is, of course, looking at a report that was done by Human Rights Watch. That's an international organization, so they don't have a bull in this fight or a dog in this fight, so to speak. They are a nonpartisan group that watches human rights issues around the globe, not just in India. So they're not taking one side or the other. They report on facts. And that is, of course, very important. Now, this article that, again, I'm referencing to was written and came out of New York just a few days ago, and it references several issues. And I'm going to bring the article to light here. India police in Delhi on November the 29th, 2024, carried out a politically motivated raid on the offices of the Association for Protection of Civil Rights. The Human Rights Watch has written this article, as I stated. The action appeared to be part of the government's crackdown against groups that criticize speech that could provoke violence against Muslims and minorities. Now, it's not that they are speaking out and saying these things that provoke violence. They are actually calling out government and other leaders who are making these speeches that are inciting and provoking violence. They are speaking out against it, and they are the ones that are being targeted instead of the people who are actually doing it. The police claim to be acting on a complaint over an exhibition by the group that documents human rights abuses and incitement to violence against Muslims since Prime Minister Narendra Modi's nationalist BJP party came to power in 2014. So they've been watching this for a very long time. The police also attempted to detain Nadeem Khan, the group's national general secretary. Now, it's perhaps, the article goes on to say that it's perhaps unsurprising that Delhi police raided the offices of a group highlighting the BJP-led government's appalling record of targeting Muslims and other minorities over the last decade. As I said, the Sikhs are very much involved in being targeted. And that was the Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, Elaine Pearson. She also went on to say that instead of revoking harmful policies and prosecuting those responsible, the government appears intent on punishing the messenger. The exhibition highlighted politically motivated prosecutions of human rights defenders in India. It also documented mob violence by ultranationalist Hindus that has killed many Muslims. and hate speech by senior BJP leaders that has repeatedly incited violence against religious minorities. Issues that have been well documented by domestic and international rights groups. And Amnesty International, there are many international groups that are very well apprised of this and documenting these situations. So again, it is corroborated in the worldwide network of human rights defenders and news and media outlets. The Association for Protection of Civil Rights said the Delhi police did not carry any notice of arrest warrant when they traveled to the southern city of Bangalore to arrest Khan in violation of due process. The police said they were investigating Khan and the APCR for allegedly promoting enmity between various groups and for criminal conspiracy. The police complaint is based on a video posted on social media of Khan showing the exhibit discussing specific cases of violence against Muslims and relevant court judgments. The video posted on X by a BJP supporter who called for police action against the exhibit was also posted separately by a BJP minister the very next day. Now, it's very important to realize that they are again being arrested for showing this atrocity or these human rights abuses and these calls for violence, and yet the people that are actually calling for the violence and doing it are not being arrested. On December the 3rd, the Delhi High Court granted Khan an interim protection from arrest for 3 days and instructed him to cooperate with the police investigation. The Association for Protection of Civil Rights has provided legal aid to a number of human rights cases across the country. These include defending activists wrongfully prosecuted under India's counter-terrorism law, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which has come up in many of stories. In a case relating to communal violence in Delhi in February 2020, in which 53 people, mostly Muslims, were killed. APCR is one of the few organizations in the country that is actively engaging in advocating for us and providing every help, including legal aid, an activist has said. Now, if we look at this, the raid on the APCR is not an isolated incident, Human Rights Watch said. Police in Uttar Pradesh state have accused Mohammed Zabir, co-founder of an independent fact-checking website Alt News, of promoting enmity between different religious groups, as well as endangering sovereignty, unity, and integrity of India, which don't even get me started on that, but that was for posting a video of a Hindu religious leader making Islamophobic remarks. On December the 3rd, the judges hearing Zubair's case in the Allahabad court recused themselves and directed that the case be listed for another bench. Zubair had posted the video showing Hindu religious leader Yadi Narashingnad, if I say that correctly, making derogatory remarks against the Prophet Muhammad in a speech on September 29th. He has repeatedly called for violence against Muslims and in January 2022 was arrested for making Islamophobic and misogynistic comments and spent a month in jail. Now, the police added charges of endangering sovereignty that could lead to Zubair's immediate arrest based on complaints. Zubair was previously arrested by Delhi police in 2022 on charges of hurting Hindu sentiments. In a 2018 post, the police opposed bail, seized his electronic devices, and secured an order to hold him for 14 days in custody while they investigated. Now, here is where it gets really interesting, is that the Supreme Court granted bail, saying that the power of arrests must be pursued sparingly. In the present case, there is no justification to keep him in continued detention and subject him to an endless round of proceedings in various courts. And Angus and I have spoken about this to no end, the fact that they will delay the court processes for months, years even, for people who are being held without any actual proper charges or who are arrested illegally or without cause. And here he was fortunate enough to get a judge that actually called them out on it and gave him the bail. So this goes on to state that the India government appears determined to silence voices that speak out against its abusive practices, as well as those who provide assistance to people facing malicious investigations, Pearson said. By punishing people for exercising their free expression rights, the government isn't silencing their message, but only adding to the mounting list of human rights abuses. And again, something that we talk about on a continuing basis. But again, it just goes to show that it is not only the Sikh community or the Sikh minority in India that is suffering at the hands of the BJP and the Modi government through human rights abuses and other systemic abuses. It shows that it's a widespread problem. It is not a new phenomena. It's been going on since the BJP took office with Modi, and it's time that the world stood up and said no more. That the world stands up and says to their leadership that they must not interact in a beneficial way to India when it comes to trade and other deals if they are not willing to put in places to protect the human rights of their own citizens in their own country, let alone to stop the transnational repression that's going on around the world, in Canada, in the US, in the UK, and who knows where else. Angus, that's really shows that it's impacting a lot more people than what we see in the mainstream media.
I think this story, I just find this really quite concerning, and all it does is it just reinforces everything that we claim about India and what is happening there. It's really very concerning. You only need to trawl through the right-wing social media to get this flavour, even just a flavour of the hatred that the right wing have towards the minorities, and particularly the Islamic minority. It's not just Sikhs, obviously, who face the persecution.
That's right.
The Islamic population in India are under terrible duress from the Indian state, and of course egged on by the right wing, who themselves are just the foot soldiers of Hindutva and the RSS. And it's I think what's clearly going on here is that anybody who actually highlights the fact of what is going on in India finds themselves facing the full force of the state machinery. And anybody, particularly in India, and obviously we see it in the diaspora, but particularly domestically in India, if anybody within the minorities, or indeed, in fact, even in the Hindu population, anybody who stands up and points out to what is going on, this dreadful persecution, this dreadful oppression of minorities, they themselves find themselves facing the state machinery. They're arrested, they are detained, and worse, and potentially they're locked up. And of course, with many examples of that going on. So what we're seeing here is firstly a two-stage process. We're seeing firstly the oppression and the persecution of minorities, and secondly the oppression and persecution of anybody who dares stand up to point that fact out. They are the messengers, and they are being oppressed themselves for pointing out this fact. This is very clearly, and I hate to say it, and in many of my podcasts of Sikh activists over the last couple of years who've made this parallel, and I cannot deny that the evidence is there to point to this very same parallel. We are seeing in India what we saw in Germany in the early 1930s. It's astonishing. This sort of behaviour from a government is heading towards totalitarianism. It is totalitarian control, and it is literally echoing what happened in Germany in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, many people, many observers, particularly in the media, pointed out to look what's happening. Look, our whole state system is being politicised. It is being politicised with one agenda. It is being politicised, and therefore control is being taken of by the ruling party to serve the agenda of the ruling party. That is what happened in the 1930s. We obviously know where that led to, and we're seeing the very same thing happening here in India, where one party has taken almost complete control of the nation, and they have politicised all the state machinery. By that I include obviously the police, all the state bodies that control the administration of India. And of course, they're now infiltrating the court system. And we see here evidence, at least, and we have reported on evidence in the past where the court system, the legal profession, has tried very hard to slow this agenda down, to at least try and stand up to this agenda. But what we're seeing is that the legal profession itself is being infiltrated, as indeed it happened in Germany in the 1930s, where the legal profession is being infiltrated by the ruling regime, and they're putting that their own people in these positions of power, who in turn start controlling the court system. So again, we will see less and less obstacles in the court system, the legal system, to stop this agenda rolling out. And that is what we're seeing in India. So, and again, I see once again, James, as you reported in this story, once again, this awful piece of legislation, the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, this basically carte blanche piece of legislation that allows the Indian state to essentially arrest and detain indefinitely anybody it feels, in its opinion, is not working to the agenda. Basically, anybody it doesn't like, it can send in the police in brute force, arrest them. Now, we see here, at least the court system tried very weakly and very feebly with what little powers it seems to have left. It's tried to slow that process down, but ultimately, under the UAPA, people like this, the human rights messengers, are being arrested and they are being detained. The messengers are being removed. So the Indian population never get to hear what is going on in their own countries. And again, let me draw the parallels to Germany in the 1930s. Most Germans apparently didn't even know concentration camps existed, even during the Second World War. They did not know that concentration camps and the Holocaust happened purely because the German government, likewise the Indian government in parallel, control the narrative, control the media. They control the message that the population gets. So if the Indian government doesn't want its population to know the horrors that it is doing, the oppression and the persecution of the minorities, it controls the media. Yes, it does. It controls the court system. Yes, it does. It controls the police. Yes, it does. Therefore, the average Indian never gets to hear what is actually going on in their own country. Because for a start, outlets like us, news outlets like us, are banned in India. And if you're in India, or even if you're a Hindu outside of India and you support the Modi regime, ask yourself, why does Modi not want outlets like us heard in India? What are they hiding? What are they trying to stop their own population from hearing? Ask yourself that very basic question. Then look at what's happening in India. We're not spinning propaganda. We're just trying to get the truth of what's actually going on in India. It's happening. We can see it unfolding. We've seen it happen before in the 1930s. We know where it leads to. We're trying to warn the people of India. This is where your country is going until the majority of that population wakes up and realizes just what is going on, James. This is a very scary story, this, I have to say.
It is. And, it's something, as I said, that we have spoken about time and time again. And to see that there is even more international attention coming out on this is definitely a path to exposing it and hopefully getting enough international pressure to start fixing it. But I don't know if that's going to happen while Modi's in office. I think that it's going to have to take a change of government there and a real hard look at how everything is folding in that government in terms of all of Modi's very close friends and those who share his same ideals. And that's where it's going to take a real turn, is when they can make this about India, the prosperity, the great nation that it can become, and actually lead it to that greatness. And that's where I think that we'll see some changes happen and them achieving greatness, not only for all of the billionaires and the politicians, but even for the lowest people in their society. I think that when they realize greatness, that is, of course, going to be judged on how they treat the most vulnerable of their country. Now, speaking of that, we've also been talking a lot, Angus, about the corruption with the Adani files and the Adani Group, with the different energy and cellular contracts, communications, and on and on and on the list goes. But what we haven't really talked about is the cause and effects of the corruption and what it's doing and what can be done to prevent it. So I thought we would take a look at that today and actually give it a summary so that people can understand a bit more about the impacts that it's having on India, on the Indian people, and that is regardless as to what religion, whether they are Hindu, whether they are Sikh, whether they are Muslim, whether they're Dalits, Christians. It's having an impact on everybody. But mostly it's having an impact on everybody outside of Modi and his group and his friends in government. So this here, I've got an article here that we'll go through, and it's basically just looking at the multifaceted issue that the deep-rooted causes and far-reaching consequences of the corruption in India. It significantly hinders the country's economic growth, social development, and overall governance. So we're going to take a quick peek at this. I've summarized everything, so we're not going to be here forever because there's so many things that we could discuss. But the causes of corruption in India. Now, there's a lot more than what we have here, but these are the main contributing factors. Now, the complex bureaucracy, of course, is the intricate and often opaque bureaucratic system, creates numerous opportunities for corruption, red tape, excessive regulations, and discretionary powers vested in officials that do continue to contribute to the problem. The lack of transparency and accountability. Of course, the lack of transparency in government processes and a weak accountability framework allow for corrupt officials to operate with impunity. And this we've seen with Modi, with others around him, that there are a lot of allegations that have been swept under the rug. So they just don't follow through or don't have the power to follow through and actually hold people accountable. The political interference, of course, is in administrative decisions that are made, appointing of unqualified individuals to key positions. And that, of course, exacerbates the corruption because they have no idea what they're doing. But if you're going to pay them or offer them incentives, of course, they're going to go ahead and do what you want because they're getting bribed. And for the fact that they can sit back and plead ignorance, saying, well, we didn't know, we weren't really qualified for this role. We didn't know that what we were doing is wrong, which, of course, in most Western nations or civilized nations, ignorance of the law is no excuse for breaking it. So the weak enforcement, speaking of law, the weak enforcement of the laws is law enforcement and lenient judicial system that often fails to deter corrupt policies. And again, there are issues with the legal system itself being corrupt in some regions and some areas. And I must say that over the last year, in terms of what I've been following personally in different stories, I am seeing some pushback by the court system in different regions of India saying enough is enough. And they are pushing back against corruption. They're pushing back against law enforcement. They are pushing back against politicians and government ministries to start offering more protection for the average Indian citizen. But again, it has a long way to go between that and actually going after the corrupt politicians and others within the society. Poverty and inequality, of course, that has a major impact because as people become more desperate and they have less resources, if there are opportunities that they can bribe officials or others for access to essential services, for access to special grants or funding that could help their farm, even if they have to pay 50% of it to a politician, is that 50% is better than nothing because they are desperate. They are in poverty. They need to feed their families. And that, of course, contributes again to the encouragement of corruption, not only to the problem, but encourages it. Now, of course, cultural factors, you look at certain cultural norms and practices such as nepotism, favoritism, and other issues such as that. And that, of course, contributes to corruption as well, because as you get more and more family or close-knit people into one ministry, then there's a lot less oversight or anybody there putting eyes on them that can actually be whistleblowers to break the corruption. So again, that is another major issue in India's politics. And we've seen that not only through direct relations, but also distant relations, cousins, uncles, aunts, nephews, all of that, where they're brought in and they may have a different last name, but they're all part of the same genetic family. Now, we can look at the effects of it. Of course, there's economic stagnation. Now, corruption diverts public funds from essential development projects, leading to economic stagnation and hindering the country's growth potential. Again, we can look at who was awarded the agriculture business contracts, who was awarded the port contracts, who is developing new airports and have those government contracts. We can go on the whole list, and yeah, that is a lot of corruption that is being levied against the government of India right now by the U.S. in over $265 million case, but there are several others that are being investigated at this time, and it's all right now accusations, and they haven't been proven in a court of law. But again, the problem with that is in India, the courts are not willing to take on the government in almost all cases when it comes to corruption, bribery, and extortion and other crimes. The inequality and social injustice, of course, it exacerbates inequality by benefiting the wealthy and the well-connected, while the poor and marginalized suffer. And we can look at the recent suffering that was picked up globally in terms of awareness and publicly in the media of the farmer protests. And again, this is another cause and effect when you look at the corruption and then you look at the impact on the people who are trying to make a living farming, or others who are in poor situations or even impoverished. So again, this just feeds into that problem, as well as the fact that there is less money that's being spent on poverty reduction and food security, because instead it's being diverted to the pockets of the corrupt individuals. Now, the erosion of public trust, that is basically goes without saying that it erodes public trust in the government, in the institutions, in the ministries, and all the different programs that are there. People have cynicism and apathy among the citizens because of this. They don't believe that these programs are actually going to benefit them, because they know there's so much corruption going on. If they cannot, as they say, pay to play, then they are left out in the cold. And I mean that literally. The poor governance, again, it is corruption undermines the effectiveness of government programs and policies, leading to poor governance and inefficient service delivery. Again, that's all part and parcel of the last part that I spoke of. Environmental degradation. Corruption can lead to environmental degradation, as corrupt officials may overlook environmental regulations to favor private interests. And this we see over and over with whether it is textiles or other chemical companies that are dumping into the rivers, dyes and everything else, as well as other toxic materials and toxic waste that goes into the waterways, that gets buried into the soils, that gets just everywhere, including the air that they breathe. As we say, India has one of the highest incidents of cancer that is brought on by airborne particulates and smog and other pollutants that are just toxic and killing at an unfathomable rate of the India citizens. So again, it could be money that's being used to enforce the environmental laws, to enforce the regulations, and to punish the corporate and other entities that are failing to act in the best interests of the environment, and even more importantly, in the best interests of the citizens and their health. So again, we can look at some of the things that can be done to help in this issue. And some strategies, I'll go through this quickly, is that strengthening the institutions. So going after the institutions with anti-corruption organizations like the Central Bureau of Investigation and the Enforcement Directorate is very important, for that they actually have the power and the transparency, by ensuring that they have that power, that transparency, and weeding out the corrupt individuals in those institutions would be a major start. Promoting transparency and accountability by implementing robust transparency measures such as e-governance initiatives and public disclosure of government information can help reduce corruption. Again, if there was a lot more public disclosure about the finances of those who are running ministries and those who are elected to office, it would go a long way, because then we could monitor, or groups and the opposition could be monitoring what is happening in terms of personal finance for these individuals, or other benefits that they're receiving from outside sources. Again, promoting the transparency and accountability would be huge in also law enforcement, the judicial system, and other investigative and regulatory processes as well. So it's not just about the politicians. Judicial reforms, of course, we've touched on that already, but speeding up trials and stricter punishment for corruption-related offenses is essential. A lot of times you see that cases may be up for investigation, but they get shelved. They sit there forever, and then people are not actually held to account. We can bring some other criminal instances that we could use as examples as well, in which people have been going for decades without being punished for the Sikh genocides and other things. So the judicial system needs to be speedy, it needs to be unbiased, and it needs to be transparent to go after all of this. Civil society engagement, of course, that is about education, monitoring the activities, and making it public. So again, more monitoring and awareness. Going with the awareness part, of course, awareness and education of the general public so that they can understand how the effects of corruption are actually impacting their community, impacting them personally, their families, their friends, and their ability to get education or employment with non-corrupt companies, because the ones who are not paying off the bribes are the ones who are suffering and not able to actually hire people or to pay the wages that they definitely should. By addressing these underlying causes and implementing effective anti-corruption measures, India can significantly reduce corruption and pave the way for a more equitable and prosperous future. And that's something that we want to see, Angus. We want to see that they have a prosperous future. We want to see that they are better off and that they move to the future with just a lot of unity and success. And that's as a country as a whole, not just as Punjab transfers into being Khalistan, which we hope will happen, but just the whole country in one totality look to have success and to reach the levels of greatness that they're capable of.
Yes, it's corruption is a deeply terrible thing for any society. Once it takes hold, it's very, very difficult to remove it. And it literally can take generations to wean a society off corruption once it becomes endemic, once it becomes systemic. I myself travelled to Nigeria and worked a lot in Nigeria, one of the most corrupt countries on the planet, many years ago, and I experienced firsthand what happens when a society is literally controlled by deep inset inherent corruption. And the trouble is, it comes from the top down, and this is the key lesson here. In Nigeria, because and of course Nigeria was an extraordinarily wealthy country. It actually still remains, ironically, one of the most wealthy countries on the planet, purely down to its natural resource, which is of course oil and gas. And of course all that money poured into Nigeria, and it was basically essentially siphoned off by the ruling elite, and very little of it was seen by the millions of people living in poverty on the streets. But what essentially happened, that message that was sent to the people of Nigeria by the ruling elite was, it's okay to be corrupt. And this really brought it home to me, because I remember one day, it was just a very simple incident which actually just opened up the whole ethos, philosophy of how this disease is so insidious and so infectious. Is that I remember going to the toilet, in fact it was in Lagos airport of all places, and I went to the sink to turn the tap on, and a little boy ran in front of me, turned the tap on, then put his hand out and said, "Right, you owe me $10. And I just thought, just that little thing, this little boy, he must have been probably, 12, 13 years old, but he has been brought up in a society that is essentially controlled by corruption. It has become normalised. Corruption is just part of the system. They expect everybody to be corrupt. And that, unfortunately, is the extreme. That's what happens when corruption just essentially takes complete control of the system. Now, India is not there yet, fortunately, but it is not in a good place. And many of our commenters regularly point out how deeply India is corrupt. And actually, ironically, the West is inherently corrupt in its own way. Quite often we see all sorts of And corruption is almost too strong a word, but in reality, let's call a spade a spade. It is corruption in the West. We see all these huge industrial complexes lobbying government, lobbying legislation so that they essentially profit from it. Essentially, it's corruption in all but name, but it's a much more nuanced, it's much more subtle, and on the face of it, it is a legal corruption because they're playing the system, but ultimately it is a form of corruption. Now, we go down the scale. At one end of the scale, we've got, let's say, Western style corruption, which essentially is corruption but on a very nuanced, very subtle scale. We get all the way down to Nigeria, where it is just overt and it's normalised and it's expected. It's literally handing over brown envelopes. And somewhere in that spectrum is India. India is on this slippery slope down towards that bottom end, because the Indian regime in the form of the BJP, and I'm probably not going to just point my finger at the BJP, I'm sure, and I don't know this for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised if earlier governments in India followed suit. It is unfortunately fairly endemic in India that this corruption is becoming systemic, and we've certainly reported on the Adani case, where again it's slightly nuanced, it is hidden. There's a lot of it is hidden behind the scenes. So fortunately, it is not so overt, but clearly at the top end, and this is where it's important, the top end of governance in India has been linked, has been tainted to corruption. Now, whether rightly or wrongly, whether provably or not, the fact that that accusation is there means it is sending a message down to all the other strata of Indian society saying, look, our politicians are up to it, our leaders are up to it, so it must be okay. So it means that if you're a middle manager, you're a lower manager, you're somebody in the street, you're a shopkeeper, you're a shop owner, you're just a local councillor, a local low-level politician. You think, well, they're up to it, so it must be okay, so I'm allowed to get up to it. And that's how, from the top down, it spreads down like a disease. It just starts infecting every layer of society. And once it gets a grip on society, it is very, very difficult to remove. It literally takes a generation or more to remove it, and that's even if the will is there to do it in the first place. Now, to change it, it can only come from two sources. It can either come from without or within. Now, without, it can come from stronger nations who, let's say, for example, trade with that nation. Let's say the United States or the West trading with India. They can impose very powerful sanctions, very powerful regulations, saying if you buy our stuff, then you have to go through all sorts of layers of compliance, which then starts imposing forms of regulation and compliance onto the nation, which slowly but surely starts turning that great super tanker around. But again, it takes a long time. It's a very slow process, and it can only succeed if those outside nations have enough power and influence over that nation. Now, India has followed an isolationist principle for many years, particularly under the BJP regime, which means it's probably unlikely that any outside influence can exert any beneficial, benign influence on India in that respect. So, which means it's got to come from within. It's got to come from the government itself with an absolutely overly powerful hand upon society saying, we will not be corrupt. Anybody who is corrupt will face the full force of the law. The punishments have got to be draconian. The courts have got to follow it up. The police have got to follow it up. And most importantly, everybody in governance must comply with the regulations. Anybody caught breaking the regulations will face extraordinary punishment. Can you see that happening in India, James? I can't see it happening. It will take a very, very strong regime to do it. It will take a regime with the intention to do it. But what that does mean, it's a regime that will not benefit from corruption. And the trouble is, the temptation's always there. And we've often seen any politicians who often, I've seen this in India itself, politicians who rise to the top, who stand on an anti-corruption ticket, what do they find very shortly? Usually the tables are turned on them. They are accused of corruption themselves, whether or not they're innocent, but quite often it's used as a weapon, and usually it's trumped up charges. They are accused themselves of being corrupt, and therefore the whole edifice starts falling down again and corruption wins again. So unfortunately, James, this is a story I find deeply sad, and if India continues down this slippery slope of corruption because it's coming from the top downwards, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to turn it around.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned the Adani Group there, and that whole situation has brought the markets down considerably in India. And also, especially when it comes to foreign holdings, foreign investors, and foreign market cap companies, they are pulling out. They are restricting their involvement. They are really watching what's going on in India right now, and it's having an impact on foreign investment and foreign currencies coming in. And as I'm looking through thousands of documents and tracking and getting to know this whole corruption scandal more, I mean, it reaches Canada, it reaches the US, it reaches the UK, and it goes high. I mean, even family members allegedly of Boris Johnson, I have seen their names in these documents that potentially could be called forward in the ongoing investigation with the Adani Group. So it is not just in India. The corruption there has actually grown tentacles and reached around the globe, Angus.
Surprise, surprise is all I can say to that, James. Knowing our politicians and our ruling class, and likewise across the West, corruption is alive and well. They just managed to hide it better. And unfortunately, it is endemic. The system, the capitalist system particularly, is, in fact, it's not just capitalism, even communism is easily corruptible. It's human nature, unfortunately. It is those who are always seduced by greed, by money. It really genuinely is the root of all evil. It seduces, and those who are susceptible to it usually are the ones who take control of societies. So, anyway, James, let us move on now in the interest of time. So, my first story, I'm delighted to say that the Sikh community has had its voice heard in the United Nations. And the United Nations recently, in the last few days, held a forum, a convention, hearing the voices of various minorities, which of course included the Sikh community. And I'm going to show you now just 2 or 3 videos, very short videos of people, members from the Sikh community or representing the Sikh community, who managed to air their views in the United Nations and were heard by the United Nations delegates. Let me play you the first one.
Sikh Assembly of America.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਛੁਰੀ ਘਾਲ ਮਰੇ ਪਕਰਦ ਭਨ ਖੰਜਰ ਬੁਗਦਾ ਨਾਏ ਅਰਧ ਰਿਜਕ ਸਭ ਜਗਤ ਕੋ ਮੋਹਿ ਤੁਮਲੇ ਹੋ ਬਚਾਏ I speak before you today on behalf of the Sikh Assembly of America to address this urgent need to protect and educate the international community on the Sikh religion, a faith founded on equality, justice, and service. Despite what the Indian media has portrayed us, we have faced ongoing transnational executions, systematic misinformation in the media, and violence orchestrated particularly by the Indian government. The only solution to these attacks is raising awareness in international media on the entire world of the Sikh religion and our determination for Khalistan, a peaceful homeland in Punjab where Sikhs can live with dignity and free from violence and persecution. The Sikh struggle for justice and education against misinforming governments has been ongoing since before Operation Blue Star in 1984, during which the Indian Army stormed Shri Darbar Sahib, the Golden Temple, destroying sacred sites, and concerningly looted the Sikh Reference Library, the largest collection of manuscripts, data, historical doctrines, and literature of Sikh history and culture. This attack on Sikh education and identity was only furthered by the massacre of thousands of Sikhs during the Sikh genocide in November. These atrocities were systematic, planned, and executed to suppress the Sikh identity. This pattern of oppression now continues globally on a transnational level. Last year, Avtar Singh Kanda in the UK and Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, prominent advocates for Sikh rights in Khalistan, were assassinated on behalf of Indian authorities. Authorities have linked these assassinations to the topmost level of the Indian state, in which Prime Minister Narendra Modi himself was involved. Similar plots have occurred in the United States and around the world, targeting Sikh activists advocating for their rights. These actions prove that the Indian government not only denies justice within its borders, but also extends its oppressive reach around the world. On behalf of the international Sikh community, we request all countries with a conscience stop accepting India's disinformation media and understand the true image of Sikhs. The only solution to the survival of the Sikhs is Khalistan. Thank you.
Wow, 500 words per minute. I guess they only have a certain amount of time to get the message across. There was an awful lot of information that was downloaded in that 1.5 minutes. I think he covered just about the whole history of the Sikh community. I mean, he managed to get Blue Star, the Sikh genocide, transnational oppression. Interestingly, he also pointed to the death of Avtar Singh Kanda, which he very pointedly said it was an assassination. So again, there's no ambiguity about his stance. That was. By the way, that was the Sikh Assembly of America, as I say, downloading pretty much everything that the Sikh community has suffered under the Indian regime, certainly since partition. Now, there were many people from the Sikh community who did stand up or sit there and give their opinions and their messages across. And the next one, I'm just picking out a couple of other highlights. The next one was a gentleman called Jaspreet Singh. He was a representative from the International Centre for Advocates Against Discrimination. Now, ICAD, as it's known, is a human rights advocacy centre that uses law, technology and the arts to help communities around the world tackle what they call systemic injustice. So they obviously stand up for their rights. This is the next video.
The International Centre for the Defence and Promotion of Human Rights, please. My apologies to have missed you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jaspreet Singh, and I'm here representing ICAD and the Sikh community. I'm also a minority fellow with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. Transnational repression occurs when states reach beyond their borders to surveil, threaten, and even assassinate those who exercise their fundamental freedoms. Today's world is rife with shocking examples of this activity, including when states send their agents to silence journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society leaders. This practice violates international law, including the UN Charter, ICCPR, UDHR, and customary international law, and undermines this body's very purpose and mandate. The Sikh community has been subjected to a wave of transnational repression by India in multiple countries, including in the United States and Canada, simply for exercising their freedom of expression. I urge states to act now by taking 3 simple steps to protect minority communities whose rights and lives are endangered by repressive regimes that seek to silence dissent. 1, recognize and condemn transnational repression as a specific threat to human rights and minority communities. 2, convene like-minded member states to engage in collective action and to combat transnational repression. 3, support the establishment of a special rapporteur on this issue. Transnational repression creates an atmosphere of fear amongst minority communities that disrupts freedom of expression and pervades everyday life. Finally, switching gears, I'd like to ask all states to invest in their minority communities, including migrants, rather than using them as scapegoats or targeting them. Your minorities will make you stronger if you invest in them and protect them. Thank you.
So again, a similarly powerful speech from the representative from ICAD, and again bringing up this whole issue of transnational repression. And all it's doing is just reinforcing in the public domain. It's reinforcing. It doesn't matter what India says, but it's reinforcing. All these organisations, one by one, are standing up and saying, look what India is doing. Look at this persecution. Look at this oppression. Look at this, what they call the violation of human rights, violation of the rule of law, violation of United Nations law. This is very powerful stuff. Now, the final one I want to show you, this is Peter Friedrich, a very interesting gentleman. Peter Friedrich is a journalist. He's actually a Western journalist who stood up for the Sikh community for many years. He's actually written some very interesting stuff, including a very interesting book called Saffron America, which was his analysis of how Hindutva has infiltrated the United States and, in fact, North America, infiltrated academia and other institutions. And of course, because of that, he's become a real target for India. They've really tried to pour all sorts of smears against him and tried to undermine his credibility. But again, his voice is very powerful and very well researched. This was his contribution at that same meeting.
To the International Defenders, thank you, Council.
I represent a coalition of U.S. NGOs, including International Defenders Council, the Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America, the New York State Council of Churches, and more. And I speak as a journalist who experienced transnational repression when RAW, India's external intelligence agency, targeted me in 2021. Understanding representation of India's religious minorities in the media requires knowing what India's media won't tell you about how they're treated. Understanding how they're treated is best prefaced by last year's assassination plots against North American Sikhs. A Canadian Sikh was assassinated at his place of worship while a plot against a U.S. Sikh was foiled. India's RAW is implicated in both plots. These Sikh activists fled violence after the 1984 Sikh genocide, the 40th anniversary of which was this month, and yet they could not find safety even abroad. The transnational repression they faced is driven by India's current autocratic direction, which is guided by a Hindu nationalist ideology that targets Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, and others, creating an existential crisis for India's religious minorities. Ongoing anti-Christian violence in Manipur is a prime example, as hundreds of churches have been torched and hundreds of Christians massacred. Throughout India, mosques and churches are invaded or demolished, mobs lynch minorities, Homes and businesses of minorities who criticize the regime are bulldozed. Anti-conversion laws criminalize the act of changing religions. And public calls for genocide of Indian Christians and Muslims made by speakers linked to the ruling party are now commonplace. The Indian government's embrace of majoritarian rule is pushing religious minorities to the brink. Prime Minister Narendra Modi exemplified that this year by crossing the church-state boundary and assuming the role of a priest to inaugurate a temple built on the ruins of a mosque which was demolished by a Hindu nationalist mob. Ensuring representation of India's religious minorities in any space, in fact even its existence at all, is not only an urgent issue but has now, as seen with these assassination plots, become a global issue. So we ask the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues to conduct a country visit to India. Thank you.
So, yeah, Peter Friedrich with an awful lot to say there, and likewise 500 words a minute. And as I say, you've got to feel a little bit sorry for the translators. You've got to try and translate that into real time at that speed. But he obviously raised a lot of similar issues, transnational repression. He even referred to the Ayodhya temple issue and just the general suppression of human rights. So again, once again, it's highlighting in a very, very significant forum. This is the United Nations who are hearing these stories firsthand from the community, from various representatives and NGOs from the community and from outside the community, just highlighting just what India is up to. Now, this is significant, James, because don't forget that the Sikh Federation is uniting all the various organisations around the world, particularly in the diaspora, to approach the United Nations to form their legal case for Khalistan. Now, that legal case can only be formed through a lot of very long, slow, steady, deliberate, considered legal steps, one of which is establishing the fact that human rights for the community in the Punjab, the Sikh community, have not been respected by India. So this forms one of those very key, very important stepping stones in the United Nations, where they are legally displaying what has happened. They are laying out their stall. They are laying out the evidence that India has not been respecting the basic human rights of the Sikh community in the Punjab. So this, whilst it does air obviously all the important issues that have been going on, it forms a very important legal marker in that long, slow process to recognise legally by the United Nations the establishment of Khalistan. So interesting times, James.
Absolutely, Angus, and they could always get a second job as auctioneers the way they speak so fast. But for our viewers wondering why that is, there is actually a clock that counts down there under a very restricted amount of time to speak, and they want to get all their points in. So that's why they speak so quickly and so rapidly. And I mean, one other fact that I saw within that whole series of videos is pointing out the cultural, the values, and the contributions of the Sikh community, which we know because we highlight those on the show all the time. And it's about standing up and bringing the truth to all the people that are within India, whether it is the Sikhs that believe in Khalistan, the Sikhs that vote against Khalistan, the Muslims and Dalits. We are here to share the truth no matter where it falls, Angus.
Indeed. And let's move on now as we're running out of time. But my second story, I reported yesterday on the appointment of Harmeet Kaur Dhillon as Donald Trump's incoming Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the United States. This, of course, raised a lot of eyebrows, some very positive ones and some very negative ones. Now, the positive ones, of course, coming from the Sikh community and any believers in human rights, who've been following, obviously, all the key stories. And Harmeet Dhillon herself has had an extraordinarily powerful background. She of course, as we reported earlier this year, she addressed she made the opening prayer, the Ardas, at the Republican convention earlier this year in front of Donald Trump. She's been an extraordinarily high-achieving lawyer fighting for basic rights, human rights, civil rights. And she's achieved an awful lot in her time in her legal profession. But she's also faced a lot of flack, a lot of criticism from, predictably, from India. Because, of course, many of her targets, or people she's been defending, have been the subject of India's ire and India's ignorance of human rights. And, of course, most of the criticism has come from India, unsurprisingly. They are terrified, frankly, that somebody from the Sikh community and somebody who's done so much for the Sikh community and so much to highlight India's behaviour, the fact that she's now been promoted to a very, very powerful position in the Trump administration, particularly on the legal side and the human rights side, India are actually quaking in their boots. And the Indian media have been beside themselves, trying to tear the whole thing down, trying to undermine her credibility. They are running scared. Now, unsurprisingly, there has been a reaction here in the UK, and the Sikh Federation likewise. Actually, this is pretty typical of the reaction from across the Sikh diaspora. And this pretty much sort of summarises the reaction. And the Sikh Federation themselves did actually release a press release yesterday. And they welcomed, unsurprisingly, this nomination of Harmeet Kaur Dhillon to her position with the US Department of Justice. And they said that the Indian government-controlled media is condemning her nomination, unsurprisingly, as she has been so critical of the Indian government's transnational repression, persecution of Sikhs in the Punjab, her backing, of course, for the farmers' protests last year and earlier this year, and speaking up for Sikh rights following the 9/11 attack. Now, the BJP were publicly blaming the US State Department for destabilising India. If you remember, last week we reported on how the spat had developed between India and the US, and India claiming that the US is interfering in the governance of India and actually trying to bring down the Modi regime. Well, it turns out that the Indian government are, unsurprisingly, trying to interfere with Donald Trump's nomination of Harmeet Kaur Dhillon. You know, the Indian government, with its policy of transnational repression targeting Sikh activists, have what they call totally lost the plot. I think that sums it up quite nicely. Now, Indian government-controlled media should stop attacking Sikh politicians in the diaspora who criticise the Indian government. They need to understand democratic backsliding, a lack of respect for the rule of law, and failing to protect minorities will result in increased criticism of the Indian regime. The pointing out the bleeding obvious, as we say here in the UK, is that if you stop this behaviour, India, then everybody else will stop attacking you and your record on human rights. It's pretty basic logic. Now, Harmeet Kaur Dhillon's professionalism is being questioned. In other words, they're trying to undermine her because they realise how powerful she potentially will be. It's been reported India is deeply worried by her appointment, as she will be involved in the US Department of Justice's ongoing cases against Nikhil Gupta and Vikash Yadav that will expose India's death squads. Of course she will. She's going to be peeling back the layers. She is going to become now a full party to all that intelligence that the US, in fact, the whole North American and in fact the Five Eyes intelligence have uncovered on India's transnational repression program, this policy to assassinate Khalistani campaigners. So, yes, Harmeet Kaur Dhillon is going to see this intelligence. No wonder that, that India is getting a little bit nervous. If the Indian government had respected the rule of law, the US Department of Justice and law enforcement agencies in the US would not need to indict Indian nationals and government employees. Surprise, surprise. And then the press release goes on to a little bit of the background of Harmeet Kaur Dhillon. She was born in India, but actually her parents moved to the UK in the 1960s, late 1960s. She lived here as a very young child, just for 2 or 3 years, and then her parents then emigrated to the United States. And her father, who clearly was a very key figure influencing her upbringing, in the 1980s, he became more politically engaged with Sikh issues as he recognised Sikhs in his birthplace, the Punjab, were being so persecuted. Of course, the 1980s, a very important time, as we often talk about. And when Harmeet herself was a teenager, both her parents became fully practising Amritdhari Sikhs. So they joined the Khalsa and they went full on Sikhi. They lived their daily lives according to the Sikh Code of Conduct, and according to Harmeet, prayed together as a family several times a day. So unsurprisingly, it has influenced, and it's seriously influenced her whole agenda. Her whole legal narrative has been built around this background, her devotion and her whole family's devotion to Sikhi. Now, Devinderjit Singh, who's obviously been a very frequent guest on my podcast, he's made a public statement as follows. He said, the Indian government-controlled media is always attacking Sikhs in the diaspora who progress in political circles and stand up for their own community. The one common thread is Sikh politicians in the diaspora who are targeted have a strong religious family upbringing, are prepared to speak up, and they have the courage to criticise the Indian government when it's wrong. political intimidation of Sikhs in politics in the diaspora is transnational oppression by the Indian government that governments across the globe need to recognise and confront. We've witnessed this in the UK, Canada, when Sikh MPs have taken up Sikh issues and condemned the Indian government's persecution of minorities. Harmeet has been heavily influenced by her parents and Sikh religious upbringing and knows what is right and wrong. We are confident Harmeet will remain in high spirits. The Sikh principle of Chardi Kala, despite the Indian criticism, that will backfire on the Indian regime. So it's very clear what the Sikh Federation, who represent many of our Sikh community here in the UK, and now, by extension, the West, they're very clear that this is a very powerful appointment. It is terrifying India, and that they have complete faith in Harmeet Kaur Dhillon to essentially highlight to the world what the Indian regime have been up to. And again, the Sikh community are known for their stance against injustice, their stance supporting human rights wherever they see them. And Harmeet Kaur Dhillon is the personification of that. And now she is going to sit in a very powerful position in the US government, James. No wonder India is running a little nervous.
And I have to say, Angus, I think it's the first time I've personally felt this much excitement about an appointment by Trump. I think it's a beautiful and just such a great appointment. I'm excited about it.
Now, there are other things that hopefully we'll talk about in a future show, and some of our commenters have pointed out the appointment of Tulsi, I forget her surname now, as the head of US intelligence. She has been seen actually hand in hand with RSS operatives, and there is a fear that her appointment by the Trump regime as head of US intelligence agencies could have some sort of RSS influence. Interestingly, and we'll talk about this maybe in another show, she is not of Indian origin, as many believe. She's not of Indian origin. She's actually of Hawaiian origin. She just became a practicing Hindu. So those who fear this appointment of Tulsi, Gabbard, that's her surname, Tulsi Gabbard, those who fear the appointment of Tulsi Gabbard, potentially to counterbalance this appointment of Harmeet Kaur Dhillon, don't worry. Although she has become a very strongly practicing Hindu, and I believe her children have all got Hindu names, it doesn't necessarily mean that she will align with the RSS. Now, we don't know that for a fact. That time will tell. Results, as we keep saying, will also will form the judgment. But don't fear the appointed Tulsi Gabbard. It doesn't necessarily represent what many fear it may represent. So, James, let us swiftly move on, as we're now way over time, as always, into our comment section. Now, I did, again, another interesting podcast with Dr. Gurinder Singh Grewal, last week, and he talked about, in great depth, in great detail, about what he called the deindustrialization of the Punjab. It is a very clear agenda by central government in India to deindustrialize, that is, to remove any commercial potential or any commercial growth of the Punjab, with a very clear agenda to leave it essentially as a commercial wasteland, as an industrial wasteland, because they recognise the fact that the Punjab is inevitably going to become Khalistan. It is going to become an independent sovereign nation. But what has India done, recognising this fact? They are following this agenda to deliberately destroy it, to leave it to what we called a scorched earth policy, to leave it into this wasteland, so to undermine the potential success of Khalistan. And Dr. Gurinder Singh Grewal set out the details, the evidence supporting this, and the evidence is extremely powerful. It is very clear. So we received obviously a lot of comments following this. And TC8410 said that, recognise how Dr. Grewal set out this evidence. And you refer to what you call the scaremongering and ongoing brainwashing to this. And yes, absolutely, it is the Godi media who have highlighted, who've deliberately glossed over what's going on and actually completely respun the narrative into something completely different. And of course, you thank us for what you call our transparency and our education, because that's what it's all about. It's trying to bring this truth to the people of the Punjab itself, who might not realise what's going on in their very own state. And so, yeah, as you rightly say, wake up and smell the coffee. It's a very tragic, selfish exploitation, especially of those at the receiving end of this. Absolutely right, James. It's terrifying what's going on in the Punjab. A very clear agenda, whether it's the pouring in the drugs or whether it's this deindustrialization.
And it's a lot of topics that just in our show, we try to get into the peeling back the top layers, but there's so many layers that, that we haven't gotten to that Dr. Grewal definitely is able to bring to the table. And that he's always a great host, always a great guest to have on because it's so eye-opening and educational.
Indeed he is, and Mukhtar Singh follows the same theme by recognising the very same fact that, yeah, Punjab is slipping towards Khalistan, but before it does, the government's policies are deliberately trying to destroy the infrastructure and business in Punjab. Absolutely it is. Now here's something that's even more scary, James, is that Ashley Kandar actually can't argue with us for once. It is a genuine gripe. Yes, one of our regular counter-narratives, Ashley Kandar, actually agrees with us for once. What is going wrong, James?
Well, hey, I guess, I don't know, is that sunshine I see coming through your window there, Angus?
It doesn't
the
happen very
craziest things
often.
are happening.
Absolutely. It doesn't happen very often. But as they say, a stopped clock is right twice a day. So anyway, but thank you, Ashley. And it is a delight for once to be in alignment on the same side of a discussion. Right, Cousineau. Now, this was a story of the West Midlands Police here in the UK trying to build bridges with the Sikh community after a terrible breakdown of relations over recent decades. Yeah. But Cousineau remains deeply cynical by saying the police are not looking to build bridges. It's purely a damage limitation exercise. Sikhs are so gullible. Well, no, I wouldn't say Sikhs are gullible, but Sikhs have a benign, I would say, default position to always give the benefit of the doubt. They always see the good in humanity. Now, it's not naivety, it is an optimistic belief, I would say. But yes, it is quite possible that this is more a damage limitation exercise by West Midlands Police. It is, but at least it is an olive branch. They are making an effort, and I think it is beholden on the Sikh community to accept that olive branch if it has been stretched out. It's been facilitated by Preet Kaur Gill, the Labour MP, and I think it would be wrong to spurn that advance by West Midlands Police. I think they have to see it for what it appears to be on the face of it. It is a reaching out to re-establish relations, and, well, if it goes bad again, then we know it was essentially a damage limitation exercise. But yeah, I think your cynicism sadly is well-founded, James. We can't really trust many people these days.
Exactly, but even with damage limitation initiatives by, law enforcement or others, it a lot of times spurs small changes that are the start of that snowball effect.
Indeed, it's got to start somewhere. So, as we say, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Harjinder Baraj says, now talking about the Khalistan issue, I think this really sums up the Khalistan, the fight for Khalistan, is look, even if there was only one Sikh alive, he would still carry on that struggle, or he or she would still carry on that struggle, even if Khalistan is 1 foot by 1 foot square. Sikh spirit is independent spirit, will always remain independent forever. Sikhs are forcibly kept under the Hindu code. This is actually another issue. This kept under the Hindu code under Article 25 and 25B. I think you're referring to the Constitution here, where yes, indeed, Sikhs were not recognised really specifically as a separate religion under the Constitution. Part of the reason why the two Singhs refused to sign that Constitution back in 1948 or 1949. Absolutely right. Grail Sequinder says, great show, thank you very much for your comment, and thank you for it. I think the constituents, here we go, James, Chandra Araya. Now, Graywell rightly points out, look, the constituents of Chandra Araya should actually ask him, look, who actually are you representing here as a member of the Canadian Parliament? Are you representing the Indian Parliament while sitting in Ottawa, or are you actually representing your constituents? I think that's a very justified question, James.
I have asked him, and surprise, surprise, he has not answered me yet.
I don't think we'll hold our breath on that one, James.
I'm sure he put my name somewhere on a list, but he didn't answer the question.
Yeah, I think our names are on a list somewhere, James. There's no doubt about that. And Mr. Mann follows up, yeah, absolutely again, with Chandra Raya. He, of course, has these deep relationships with Modi's Hindutva Nazi government, as you call it, and is giving them favours by not voting for the Senate genocide of Sikhs. Absolutely right. He is a placeman of Hindutva, sadly. And all we can do is keep pointing it out and holding him to account for that very thing. Now, Joy S5L says, Sandeep Sandhu comment is absurd. Indeed it was, absolutely. One of our critics. And I think Sandeep had said that Sikhism was effectively another form of Hinduism. And yet again, we had to trot out that it is absolutely not. But as you rightly point out, it sounds like he is a pro-Indian national. Yes, sadly, well, there's nothing wrong with that about being a pro-Indian nationalist. It's just if you're an extremist and you soak up and you are indoctrinated by this nonsense narrative that the Indian state keeps pouring out. Again, there's nothing wrong with nationalism in itself. It's just if you support it under a completely false premise, which is unfortunately what many Hindus are doing. They have been misled. The truth is, the Khalsa stands on its own. It's nothing to do with Hinduism at all. Now, this is interesting, a philosophical point. Khalsa is a religion. Hinduism is a culture. Yeah, that's a big topic, James. I don't think we have enough time to go down that rabbit hole.
No, I think our clock is ticking here.
Now, Knockdown says, this is back to an interesting point, actually, that was raised in an earlier show about what is India. And again, we didn't have time to discuss what is India. But you rightly point out there's no such thing as India or as an Indian. India was invented by the British when they united 526 estates or nations with different languages, tribes, religions, cultures, food, etc. Exactly right. British left India in the hands of one, as you call, criminal tribe, essentially the Brahmins. No more India. All 526 estates should be free to decide their own future. Indian word itself is disgusting for nations. Yeah, this is a really big point, James, that Knockdown's making here, is that the British were responsible for uniting these 526 estates, these different tribes, essentially, these different regions, all with their own specific culture and identity, and united them under one essentially artificial premise, one artificial boundary, and stuck a big stamp on it and called it India, and then handed it lock, stock and barrel over to the Brahmins and said, there you go, there's a pre-packaged colony, get on with it and enjoy yourselves. And that's basically what's happened, James.
Absolutely it is.
Now, Mr. Mann points out, Khalistan stands with Bangladesh. India must stop bullying Bangladesh. Now, I haven't done a story on this, and I've been wanting to, but unfortunately we haven't had time because it's been trumped by many other bigger stories. But what's going on in Bangladesh is pretty horrific. We have touched on it several times. And India has been interfering in Bangladesh a lot. When Sheikh Hasina, the leader who fled just a couple of months ago, when she fled, she was basically very close to the Modi regime. And there had been accusations that essentially Hasina was rolling out a pro-Modi agenda. Now that Hasina has left, India is doing its damnedest to interfere in what's going on in Bangladesh further. It's finding, as it's discovering to its cost, it is finding that Bangladesh and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party are pushing back very robustly, saying, no, I'm sorry, we are an independent nation. You get your sticky paws out of our nation. So I think there's nothing wrong, as you say, Mr. Mann, with Khalistan standing side by side with Bangladesh. I think they can find a very powerful ally there.
I do definitely agree with that, Angus. I've been watching that situation very closely, and I think you summed it up perfectly.
Curios says, thank you, gentlemen, for highlighting Delhi's dirty tricks campaign against the Sikhs. Karma is real. Yeah, now I picked this comment up because I think that actually it's that word, karma is real. Karma is actually a Hindu philosophy. It is part of Hinduism. And I think, yeah, how ironic that one of the very tenets of Hinduism, karma, really is deeply relevant to what the Indian regime is up to. This Hindu Rashtra, I don't think the Hindu extremists realise that they're not even looking at one of the central tenets of their religion. Karma is real, and your oppression, your persecution of the minorities, which, and I don't profess to be an expert in Hinduism, but I would lay a very large bet that respecting humanity and human rights is a pretty fundamental principle of Hinduism, and if it isn't, it should be. So I'd sense, James, that karma will come back and bite these people on their proverbials.
I truly believe that.
So thank you, Curios, for that one. And Haji Rosha, I love this comment, James. My ambition is that one day you both do this programme wearing turbans. I am sure critics will call you both Khalistanis. Well, I would be very proud to call myself a Khalistani. I have no problems at all calling myself a proud Khalistani. Whether or not I would wear a turban, well, if I followed any particular religion, I would have to say, James, that Sikhi, I have to say, does stand to me. And I've been exposed to an awful lot of religions throughout my lifetime. I've seen what they stand for. And I have to say, Sikhi stands to me as one of the most powerful, one of the most seductive in a positive way, one of the most persuasive religions in terms of everything it stands for. It stands for everything that is good about humanity. The whole equality thing, just everything it stands for is deeply, deeply appealing. Would I convert to Sikhi? I don't know. That's a very deeply personal question. Who knows? But I certainly stand for Khalistan, and I have a deep love for Sikhi because I think it stands for everything that is good about humanity, James.
Absolutely. The culture, the beliefs, the equality. I mean, what's not to love about it, and what's not to love about the people?
Indeed, and on that very deeply powerful and positive note, we must draw things to a close. But please don't forget to keep those comments pouring in as they have been. Thank you for all of them. Thanks once again for all the supportive comments. Thank you again for the detailed comments and the facts that we might not be aware of. It's always very useful and very helpful and very interesting for us to discover these facts as you highlight them. So do keep those comments coming in. Don't forget you can message us directly at message@satellitetv.com if there's anything you'd like to message us directly about you don't want to put in the public domain. But we must draw things to a close for another day. Thank you so much for watching Perspectives. It is a goodbye from me. It is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
We will see you next time.